Good morning, everybody, and welcome to KASB's live update of the legislative session. This is update number 2 for 2020, and we're happy to see you all. This is our first update since we had our Advocacy in Action meeting last week, and then we also had an ice storm on Friday. So this is our catch-up of last week and preview of next week. I'm here today with Rob Gilligan and Scott Rothschild. Our fearless leader, Mark Tallman, is out of town attending a wedding, and we will attempt to carry on in his absence. So since we saw you all last, we have had a few things happen in the legislature the past week and this week. And the first thing that we would like to touch on that we haven't really briefed you all on yet is Governor Kelly's budget and K-12 education. Scott, you want to talk about that?
Sure. Well, I mean, it feels like years ago, but
does.
just a few days ago, the governor had her State of the State, and then the next day she released her budget. And as far as education goes, there's a lot of the same. I mean, the school funding phased-in increases are pat in the budget. Increases to base state aid for the next 3 years, I believe. And then, but because the new enrollment estimate was lower than expected, there is a savings to the state of about $35 million. And the State Board of Ed would like that money to go to special education. The governor's budget does not do that, but maybe there will be some efforts during the session to do that. Also in the governor's budget, there is a increase in the school mental health project, which has kind of pretty much gotten pretty good reviews, has done a lot of good work in the districts that it's been placed in. So her budget proposal would increase that by about $5 million. So aside from that, as far as the funding goes, those are the big differences. Her budget does increase local option, capital outlay, capital improvement, so it does include some increases in those areas. But the base state aid is in line with what was agreed to by the Kansas Supreme Court. Increase in the mental health project, which seems to be money well spent. I mean, everyone is saying it's a great thing to help our kids. Higher ed, she does have some budget increases for that, but I don't think it's what higher ed wanted. They wanted a little more because they had been cut during some years. So that's pretty much what her budget is, and the governor's budget is always the starting point, and traditionally, a lot of the governor's budget gets passed. We had a little glitch there. So, and that's about it.
All right.
All right.
So the next thing, obviously, the big topic the session so far for education is the at-risk audit. LPA put that audit out in December. You've seen our reviews and information online that you can check out. The presentation by the auditors was made in front of 3 different committees this week. So both the House Education Committee, House K-12 Budget Committee, and then yesterday finished up with the Senate Education Committee. Of course, the big conversation being differences of interpretation of what the law requires and what the state ultimately does through KSDE. LPA's interpretation should be that ultimately there should be an approved list of programs and investments that can be made that are eligible for at-risk dollars. The state argument believes that each district needs to make a plan of action for their at-risk investment, justify that in their plan that they send to the state, and the state reviews that, and if it feels like it is research-based and with good evidence, they will approve that as a good use of at-risk dollars. So really it seems like the main conflict is the interpretation of what the intent of law is and what this conflict will be. How that plays out in the legislature is what we will remain to be seen over the course of the next few weeks. The conversation and really the next few months is focused this year, of course, because of the sunsetting of the high-density at-risk weighting. So for those that don't remember, a district that has over 35% of the students, and we have a building level, so this would be 35% of students in a building that are free lunch. They would be high density in that building, and they would receive an additional weighting on top of the standard at-risk weighting for all free lunch students. That is scheduled to sunset at the end of this fiscal year 20, and so June 20. Yep. I guess I need to go check the battery real quick.
So that's scheduled to end or sunset on July 1st, 2020, unless the legislature takes some action this year. So that's what we'll be keeping an eye on, and especially in reference to this sort of controversy or disagreement about at-risk.
Well, and the other thing on the at-risk budget, I think that some legislators are pointing out is that according to the State Department of Education, we are underfunding
Right.
at-risk funding. So, and by the tune of about $80 million, similar to what we've done with special education. So that's something that has been pointed out by the audit. We are serving a lot of students with at-risk programs, but we are not getting the complete funding
That's right.
from the state to do that.
I think people need to be aware that this is probably going to be a continuing topic. I think Rob noted that, and so we really need our members to be able to talk to their legislators, to their stakeholders in their community about how they use their at-risk funding, why it's so important, how it has narrowed those achievement gaps that we've seen, and so this is something we really need folks to be able to talk about. Your business office has this information. You know, you as the school board members and as the administrators have access to this information, and you know, they need to hear not only from your professional lobbyists here in Topeka, but they need to hear from you about how you use that very important at-risk funding.
Yeah, I mean, I think legislators were asking for that information. Yeah. I mean, and it's a confusing topic. It's a complicated topic. And, you know, once you get in the classroom, it's, you know, seeing it from 50,000 feet and seeing it from the eyes of a classroom teacher, totally different. And that's, I think, what our education leaders throughout the state need to get that across to legislators.
Yeah, really kind of a great opportunity for a plug. Legislators will most likely start having their area dialogues, coffees, events, and activities within their districts over the next couple weeks. Usually they get started about the end of January, first part of February. A great opportunity for school leaders, school board members, administrators, teachers, faculty, staff, parents, anybody that wants to sit down and have a conversation with them to make sure that they can understand this issue. The legislature will need to vote on the extension of that at-risk high-density weighting this year. And so it will come up for all legislators, and they need to be part of that conversation.
That's right. Another issue that we were following this week was updates on at the House Education Committee from the Bullying Task Force and the Dyslexia Task Force. That was late in the week. The Bullying Task Force recommendations were presented to the House Education Committee, and that's the committee that kind of helped start the conversation last year. There was some concern along with the members of the K-12 Ed Budget Committee about bullying in schools. How do we address that? How do we help kids deal with those issues? The state developed the Bullying Prevention Task Force, and it met throughout the summer and fall and developed recommendations that it delivered to the State Board of Education in December, and then they presented those recommendations to the House Ed Committee this week. I think some of the members were a little bit nonplussed about the recommendations. I think some of them were looking for a little more stick to the recommendations. There was some bipartisan concern about, you know, if I have a child or a constituent who is bullied and they report it, you know, how are you handling that, schools? What are you doing to stop this? You know, and you all, board members and administrators, you know what you're doing. You know there are an incredible amount of things that you need to take into account when you're investigating the incidents or alleged incidents, and there are student privacy protections that are in place. So there are things that you are doing now, but for people who are really concerned about the bullying issue, you know, they still feel like maybe it's not enough. So there was some bipartisan concern from members of the committee about how this is going to play out, and so I think that may be a continued topic of some concern for that committee as we move forward. Dyslexia also gave their report, not too much of additional worry or concern there from that task force.
So really, it seemed like the committee really sees that there's a lot of work being done, especially at KSD level, on
Right.
dyslexia and trying to move forward with some of the recommendations that the committee came up with about a year ago. But your read, and the read I kind of get, is probably expect to see some new legislation or some re-emergence of legislation from last year related to bullying. The committee didn't seem to feel like the task force had gone far enough yet.
Yeah. In fact, Chairman Hubert said, I think maybe a little follow-up in April might be good to see, help us understand what kind of progress you're making. So again, this is another thing you need to be prepared to discuss with your legislators.
Good deal. Speaking on follow-up on progress, something that's been a conversation point for multiple years, Senate Bill 387, I believe, came back up for conversation in the Juvenile Justice Committee.
Yeah, this was, I think it was 2016, the Senate bill. It was an overhaul of the juvenile justice system. I think in a very general term, the emphasis was to try to keep kids from being detained, from being put in detention, try to keep them in the community, try to find community-based services for kids who are having some troubles. There's always been a little pushback on this. It seems like we always kind of go back and forth. Well, do we really punish these kids, or do we take care of them in other ways? And I think the research is basically in the camp of let's try to treat these kids where they're at. Most kids, Chairman Jennings, he was pretty philosophic about it. He says, teenagers are dumb. They do stupid things, and 90% of them are going to straighten out, at the end. So these reforms, they're kind of in their third year of implementation. There have been all kinds of things stair-stepped in, and it seemed to me that the feeling of the committee, although there was some concern, some district judges have kind of said my hands are tied on some issues when handling, when dispensing with juvenile cases, but there seemed to be sort of a consensus that they're going to let it ride. They want these reforms to take root and to see if they're helping out. And so I don't expect a lot of changes, at least in that committee, on the issue of juvenile justice.
Good deal. So probably the last topic we really kind of followed this week, Judiciary Committee in the House had a hearing yesterday on House Bill 2450. This would amend the Indoor Clean Air Act. So for those of you that may not remember, about 10 years ago, the legislature took up a discussion on indoor clean air and went through a pretty contentious debate and discussion about banning smoking inside of public buildings in Kansas. That bill ultimately passed, was signed by the governor, and has been in law now for about 10 years. It is interesting, the Attorney General yesterday in discussion said it was pretty contentious. He was a senator at the time of that debate and remembers the debate and different opinions, but now it's pretty much just an accepted fact, and in fact, it's kind of odd if you walk into a building that allows smoking inside, they change. So the Attorney General at that time pointed out about a year later that there was not included in that legislation e-cigarettes or electronic cigarettes, and it kind of made the recommendation if they wanted to be included, the legislature would have to act. They have not acted for about 10 years or so, and this year at the request of the Attorney General, a bill was introduced to update the Indoor Clean Air Act in Kansas that would include a definition of electronic nicotine delivery devices, or e-cigarettes, in the legislation. So that hearing was held yesterday. Only proponents for that, we did speak in support of the legislation as we adopted a policy of that. So it'll be interesting to see where this kind of goes and how that conversation occurs. A little bit of conversation from the committee members about the effects of secondhand vapor, like smoke. So secondhand smoke, or what they would call, the output of the e-cigarette, and whether or not there's a health risk, as there is to the health risk of secondhand tobacco smoke. So it'll be interesting to see how that conversation goes. Some of the conferees certainly offered information there. So a conversation that's just getting started, may see some activity, though we know a lot of discussion around vaping has been occurring over the past year. And of course, On the federal level, they adopted T21 policies in December of this year. So we can see a lot of focus here, and I think that debate probably will continue throughout the session.
Do you want to touch on the lawsuit too? The lawsuit bill?
Sure, yeah. So well, that'll transition us to next week then. That kind of wraps up the stories from this week. Next week, we've got a little bit of activity, 3 different hearings that we want to highlight for you. On Wednesday, the Judiciary Committee will be back once again for a hearing. This one, once again, at the request of the Attorney General, and is related to lawsuits and restricting districts and local municipalities of heading into a lawsuit on a contingency basis. So contingency being fees aren't agreed to up front. It would be you'll help cover costs as it moves on, but you'll become the plaintiff. This has been common, and we've seen about 8 districts in the state of Kansas sign on to contingency lawsuits this year based on the impacts of vaping on students and the costs and the expenses the districts are having to face and trying to combat that as a health issue for students there. And so it is believed that the Attorney General is requesting this, and ultimately it's kind of explained as his goal and view from the Attorney General's office is it would be easier to coordinate that through the AG's office versus individual school districts working with individual attorneys and grouping together from the private side. And so I think that is the reason that they would like to see a limitation on district's ability. We plan to provide testimony for this case next week. Of course, to us, this is an issue of local control and limiting the hands of our locally elected school board members, and we'll make sure and share that with the committee next week on Wednesday.
Let's note real quick that this proposal would not impact the school districts who have already entered into litigation.
You bet.
So
Only
it's
future
moving
agreements.
Forward. So didn't want anybody to panic there. Also next week on Tuesday, we're going to be sitting in on a hearing on Senate Bill 250, which is a bill that was introduced that talks about race-based discrimination, and it specifically says that you may not discriminate against someone based on their hairstyle or hair texture or how their hair is styled or how it looks. We will be providing neutral testimony. Our take on this is that discrimination based on race is always wrong. We always advise our districts very strongly against that, and so we feel that hair texture or hairstyles are covered in that protection against racial discrimination. But we also, say that, denoting that hair texture is probably something that some folks might feel is helpful. We, however, feel that, the general prohibition on racial discrimination already covers that, and so we will be presenting some neutral testimony to that effect.
You bet. So probably the biggest story for next week, though, of course, on Thursday, the House K-12 Budget Committee will be holding a hearing related to a current law and the expansion of a tax credit that is allowed for private school individuals. So Leah will be taking up testimony on that, providing some information there, and I know Scott's got some research to give us a little background on what's going on there. But this is something currently in place that we already have active, but with certain limitations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think this law is about 3 or 4 or 5 years old. Basically, you can make a donation to a scholarship fund, and you get a tax credit for that scholarship fund. Every year, the state puts out a report. We've just put it up on our website if you want to look at it. And basically, this shows how much in contributions have been made in scholarships and how much have been approved. And basically, we're up to, let me see if I can find that real quick. Okay, last year there was about $2.3 million put in these scholarship funds and about $1.8 million in tax credits. It's a 75% per dollar tax credit. So this has been going on for a few years, and this bill would greatly expand that ability.
That's right. The current law limits the students who are eligible for these tax credit scholarships to students who qualify for free lunch and who attend a public school that is listed as one of the 100 lowest performing elementary schools in the state. That's the current law. This bill that we will be opposing on Thursday broadens that to any student who is eligible for free or reduced lunch, and it also completely eliminates the provision about the 100 lowest performing elementary schools. So that it's basically anybody pre-K through 12 who is free or reduced lunch would be eligible to receive one of these scholarships. Now, the bill does say that the schools that award the scholarships, or really their vouchers, they do have to be an accredited private school. So that's current law, and the bill continues that. However, this is what KASB feels is an unconstitutional provision of public funds to private schools. All of the scholarship granting organizations are Christian organizations, and the schools who are listed as being the voucher recipients are also Christian schools. If that is something that you want to choose for your child in Kansas, then that is certainly an option for you already. However, many folks perhaps do not subscribe to having church and state mixing in their child's school, and they prefer to have the public school setting. There's also not very much beyond a religious school in many parts of our state. Once you get outside of Wichita, Kansas City, Topeka, which is where most of these scholarship granting schools and organizations exist, there really are no options for anyone if they feel like their public school is not serving their child. So our opposition to vouchers remains strong. We believe if there is an issue with the public school, we need to fix the public school. We don't take money away from the public school in order to fix a problem. So we will be opposing that bill along with several other of our allied organizations on Thursday.
So that'll be Thursday afternoon at 3:30 in the House K-12 Budget
right.
Committee, and we'll pretty much wrap up next week. That'll kind of be the end of the week, and of course we'll be back here next Friday with updates for any activities. Scott or Lee, any other thoughts of things that we should be looking for early on in the session?
Well, I think like we've emphasized earlier, is that we really need to speak to our legislators about at-risk funding. We need to speak to our legislators about bullying, and any time you can contact or have an interaction with a legislator, it's good for us, because they need to hear what's going on the ground.
Yeah.
Good point.
Good points.
So Leah, of course, will not be joining us next Friday because she'll be on the road to D.C.
That's right.
NSBA's national conference. Any preview thoughts you want to have for that?
Well, they're really focusing on 2020 being an election year, and how do we talk to our legislators in D.C. about education issues that are so important for our students, and just reminding them that the voters are watching education. There are other things going on in D.C. right now, but we also want to focus on what's best for kids, and so we will be attending a number of briefings and then having some in-person visits with our members of Congress next week. We're taking a good delegation of about just a little over a dozen folks, and it'll be a quality experience for our members.
Good deal. Well, don't forget, you can always reach out to any one of us by email. Find us all on Twitter, of course, or stop by and visit us at the State House.
That's right.
We'll certainly be there for at least the next couple weeks and having some fun. Thank you very much for tuning in to our show this morning, and we'll touch base next week. Be sure to check us out each night on Facebook Live with those updates.
Thanks.